persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
The end of the Second World War saw a major shift in global trends. Newly established superpowers such as the United States and the USSR begin competing over ideological dominance and influence. This would usher in new global security concerns that were previously unheard of in any time in history. In order to measure this, nuclear physicist Eugene Rabowitsch formed an organization called the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. The group would devise a project taking form in a metaphorical clock called the Doomsday Clock. The purpose of this clock was to measure how close humanity was to complete catastrophe. The likelihood of global catastrophe would be calculated depending on how close the clock was to midnight. For example, in 1953, the Doomsday Clock was sitting at 2 minutes to midnight because of Cold War tensions and the Soviet Union's development of thermonuclear weapons. China's involvement in the Korean War also heightened tensions between the nuclear powers, considering China was an ally of the Soviet Union at the time. And in 1991, the clock stood the furthest at 17 minutes because of the fall of the Soviet Union, bringing an end to the Cold War and easing tensions between nuclear powers. The year 2020 saw a disturbing development in the history of the Doomsday Clock, as it stood the closest to midnight at only 100 seconds to, and the continual development of nuclear weapons.
We have
The
indeed
atomic bombs
normalized
that were
a
dropped
very
on
dangerous
Hiroshima and
world
Nagasaki
in terms of the risks of nuclear warfare and climate change.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding.
The atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 were the first and remain the only use of nuclear weapons to be used in warfare. Survivors of the initial explosion would soon be exposed to radiation, which would lead to an increase in cancer and birth deficiencies. The effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still loom over the discussion of nuclear weapons, especially in contact with humans. Testimony from survivors of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains one of the most essential pieces of information regarding nuclear weapons and its effects.
ピカッと光った時に炎が入ってきて、それで2人がやけどして、で2人が怪我をしたんですよ。やけどもひどいやけどでした。やけどの跡がもういつまでもね大きなもう水が入った袋になって、それがいつまでも残ってた。ケロイドになった。やけどはもうピカッと光った時に熱線が当たった人がやけどで、飛ばされた人が怪我をしてる。そしたら私は幸いなことに自分で外にまで出てくることができたけど、建物の下敷きになっているものは自分でどうすることもできないから助けを求めてました。母に助けて助けてと。
In 1983, American popularizer Carl Sagan wrote an article titled Nuclear War and Climate Catastrophe, in which he discussed the dangers of nuclear weapons. He would discuss this further on a panel which aired after the premiere of the 1983 film The Day After, about life after a nuclear war.
The nuclear winter that will follow even a small nuclear war, especially if cities are targeted, as they almost certainly would be, involves a pall of dust and smoke which would reduce the temperatures not just in the northern mid-latitudes, but pretty much globally to sub-freezing temperatures for months. In addition, it's dark. The radiation from radioactivity is much more than we've been told before. Agriculture will be wiped out, and it's very clear that beyond the 1 or 2 billion people who would be killed directly in a major nuclear war, 5,000-7,000 megatons, something like that, the overall consequences would be much more dire, and the biologists who've been studying this think that there is a real possibility of the extinction of the human species from such a war.
Evidence suggests that nuclear war, even on a small scale, would have devastating consequences towards humanity. One major factor to consider when discussing the prospects of nuclear war is its impact on the environment. In the situation of a nuclear winter, that it would create enough smoke to block out sunlight, which would kill most photosynthetic life on Earth. When observing the impact of nuclear testing in the 1950s and 60s, studies found that a single nuclear explosion created more pollution than the entire 1991 Kuwaiti oil fires. It is also worth noting that the issues of climate change and nuclear weapons are more intertwined than one would think. Many current trends in international politics are also worrying given the current crisis we are facing and the possible escalation. According to political scientist John Barnett, the current escalation of climate change is a conflict multiplier due to the scarcity of resources that will come as a result, given that so many nations now possess nuclear weapons and the possibility of rising tensions. This should be called for worrying. The impact of nuclear weapons on the environment also exists on a much smaller scale. One example is quite significant.
Maralinga Test Range in the stark, wide-open spaces of South Australia. Operation Buffalo involved setting up a village for servicemen taking part. And the team of scientists was headed by Sir William Penny, seen arriving to supervise and observe the atomic explosions.
The nuclear tests that were conducted in Maralinga in South Australia during the 1950s by British and Australian personnel created irreversible damage on the surrounding environment. The exposure to radiation would affect both researchers and military personnel based in the area and make Maralinga completely uninhabitable for many years to come. This is highly troublesome considering that there was a population living in Maralinga at the time that these tests were conducted, and that this event would have irreversible damage on their community and lifestyle. Despite this happening over 60 years ago, these tests still have a huge impact on the Maralinga Indigenous community today. Despite a royal commission and attempts at cleaning up the site is still largely exposed, with radiation still contaminating the area.
The government has maintained that there was no hazard to anybody connected with the tests. It's a lie, because on the Montebello Islands to this very day, on Tremuya Island, which was the island where the bombs were set off, there are signs that say radiation hazard area.
Maralinga to this day remains a haunting example of the effects of nuclear weapons and the devastating consequences of their usage. There have been some developments in nuclear disarmament recently. For example, the United Nations recently passed the Treaty on the Prohibitions of Nuclear Weapons earlier in 2021, with 86 signatories. The only question now is how likely are the prospects that these weapons will be used before anything is done about them.